So this presentation is really going to talk about the soil food web and the biological components of that. I can get there, we go. So today I'm really going to first introduce just some basic soil principles because it's really important that everyone gets a baseline for that. Then I'm going to talk briefly about some of the nutrient cycling that are both important for plant growth as well as the soil microbial community. Talk about that microbial community, some things that control their activity within the soil, and then some methods in being able to balance that system back so that you can get a better benefit from the biological community within the soil. So first, just the basics about soil. This is a unit of soil. It's known as a pedon. The biggest takeaway with all of this is to understand that soil is very dynamic. So anytime you look at a soil, you take a soil test, you're looking at one point in time. You are not looking something that's static. It is always changing. Every little thing, temperature, moisture, heat, the time of year, depending on the growth of the plants and how they actually affect that soil is constantly changing. And so having that in mind when you do take a soil test or you do amend a soil is important to understand that that needle moves around a lot. But you want to take that general idea that if you take a soil test, you generally want to do that at the same time and under the same conditions that you've done in a previous time so you can compare those two. It's awfully more beneficial than if you took one, say, after you had a very large rainstorm in the spring, and then the next time you took it after a drought in the fall. You would have very different results, and that has nothing to do with necessarily the soil. It had more to do with the influence of the community. Then the soil is made up of layers. The top layer is generally that organic layer that is not necessarily considered to be soil. That's the growing component there. The actual soil that we call is the A horizon. This starts down here below the dark spot and goes down to this. That's kind of what we consider topsoil. And then this here is the B horizon, and the roots hopefully are going to grow into that B horizon. That has a lot of minerals in it and a little bit less of microbial community as well as organic matter. And then down here at the base is what we call the C horizon, or the parent material, often the bedrock. And soil is formed from the bottom up and actually weathers through many different processes and moves upward through the soil to the topsoil. So if we were to take a shovelful of soil or even a handful of soil, and a healthy soil, this is kind of what we want our balance to look like. We have about half of it made up of the physical component of it. That 45% of that is going to be the actual minerals in the soil. And then if we have a really great soil, we're looking for about 5%. Of course, in certain areas of the world, if it is very warm, it will be very difficult to build the soil organic matter to 5% unless you are under waterlogged conditions where it's like a wetland soil. That often you can build because the soil is just not being broken down by organisms that would normally use oxygen in order to be able to break down the plant matter. But in general, you can often aim for 5%, but don't feel depressed if you're, say, in Florida and you just cannot get it above 1%. If you can get it at 1% in Florida, you're actually doing pretty well. So the other half of this handful or shovelful of soil is pore space. And so that's kind of where both our water, which is very important to have for our roots in our plants, as well as the organisms that live in that soil, and air, because both roots and organisms breathe. And so this component here, we want it to be about 50-50, having that pore space filled with some air and some water. But then when I talk about organic matter, what do I really mean? And I like to say it's just the living, the dead, and the very dead. So organic matter has a cycle. It is essentially all the living things that you have trees, maybe you have some dead organism on the top that is going to decay. It is decayed by the soil organisms that live within the soil and above the soil. And then they release all of the nutrients that particular component was made of. So if it's a tree and it falls in the woods and it starts to decay, all the nutrients that tree took up when it was living is part of it. And the organisms break that down and release those nutrients back into the soil, as long as that's not removed. And the other component on that shovelful of soil is the minerals. And there are specific sizes that actually classify soil. So it's anything under 2 millimeters. And so a sand particle is relative to the rest of them is a fairly large particle. And then we have silt, which is kind of our medium-sized particle, and then clay, which is extremely small. And so when we think of a soil texture, it is really just describing the percentage makeup of your mix of sand, silt, and clay. But what's important to understand about when we kind of compare these is not just the size and maybe how they fit together. You know, if you think how many beach balls can you put together, but then in between the beach balls, you can put golf balls and you can put marbles. And I like to visually think of that as the sand, silt, and clay. But if I were to think about a volume of a sand particle, and here I have just 1 millimeter cubed of sand, and it is a total surface area of 6 millimeters squared. But then if I go and I divide that up in that same volume, if I'm looking at clay, still 1 millimeter cubed, but the total surface area is 6,000 millimeters squared. So there's a huge difference. And the number of pieces that can fit within that same 1 particle of sand, I can fit 1,000 million particles of clay. So it gives you an idea of kind of their physical and their chemical influences on the soil. That clay, because then now you have so much more surface area, even though it's in the same amount of area or volume, that has a large influence on some of the properties of your soil. And so depending on how much clay you have in there can really influence your water holding capacity. When you think about a surface area, and water likes to cling to surfaces. And so if it's clinging to surfaces, and you may have a very high volume of water within your soil, if you have high clay, it still may be unavailable. So that soil may feel wet, it may seem wet, but yet the plants cannot get that water off of there because of the cohesion and adhesion forces of the water that's just clinging to all of those surfaces, which is important also for the soil biological community as well. So another thing that this kind of makeup of sand, silt, and clay also influences is a thing we call bulk density. It's basically the amount of weight per a volume. And really, there's a lot of numbers on here, but what I really want to kind of point out is the differences from something that is an ideal bulk density for plant growth compared to a bulk density that restricts root growth. And it isn't very much of a difference, but the difference is less here compared to when we look at clay, and how the bulk density is much lower for clay, and then 1.47 being not quite as close as the sandy soil being, well, that's ideal, but down here, even it's not even close to that, it's going to be extremely compact. So sometimes when you send a soil test away, you can get the bulk density. Often they'll give you the weight over volume. And that is a reference to the bulk density of the soil. It's not an exact measurement, but it is close. And so what we hope to do is ensure that we reduce that bulk density so it's like more light and fluffy, more pore space in there, because it's really important to have that airspace and that place for the water to go as well. So the reason why this is really important is compaction. And if you're walking over a space or driving over with a tractor, or even in the case here, this is what we call a plow layer or a hard pan in a field. Often with a plow continually going over this space over and over again, what it does is kind of like it smooths it off like a trowel. If you're thinking about a cement walkway and the guy takes the trowel and he smooths it out. Well, that's kind of what a plow does over time. And it kind of smooths off that layer. And unfortunately, what it does is it actually makes it very impermeable and very hard for anything, water or a root, to get down past that layer. So unless that is broken up, this root, unfortunately, is limited as to the space at which it can grow in, and also the water will not infiltrate there as well. Whereas a healthy soil that is not compact allows for that very healthy root growth, and those roots can go deeper into the soil, reaching those minerals and likely water that's stored there, because this soil could store a lot more water compared to this soil as well. Often what this would lead to is water getting in here, pooling, and then beginning to run off if there was any slope. And the other problem with soils that end up forming a surface crust is that your seeds that are trying to germinate, and I know this is very small to see, they can't make their way out of there as well. So all of this is important for our plant growth, but is equally important for the microbial community that does the nutrient regulation within the soil. If they don't have water and they don't have air, if roots can't grow there, microbial community has a difficult time inhabiting that space as well, because they rely on the living component, or the roots that go into the soil, as food source, because they need to recycle that organic matter. And so they do help in keeping the tilth, or the fluffiness of the soil, but if it's extremely compacted because of continuous driving over that space, then you will not have that soil being inhabited by many organisms. So now I want to switch gears and talk a little bit more about the nutrient cycling. So there's some really important cycles that influence large amounts of things. And then there are, of course, many different nutrients that have their own specific cycles. I'm only going to touch on a few of them. So the carbon cycle, that's really the cycle that kind of allows our planet to exist. We have plants that can utilize that carbon dioxide, and then they can put some of that carbon dioxide in within their own components, as well as putting that down into the soil. And when they do it, put it into the soil, not only is it in the root system, but it's also being exuded where it can be a food source for organisms. In the case for grass, it grows in the summer. When it goes dormant, the roots actually do die away, and they then begin to keep that carbon down in the soil. And as long as this isn't disturbed, often most of that carbon continues to be stored down in the soil. And often the big buzzword these days is carbon sequestration, and that's kind of how that works. Biggest key is don't disturb that soil, because all of that carbon that is stored in the soil, as soon as you disturb it, often gets released back into the atmosphere. So if we store it, we need to keep it there. It's like a savings account that we never spend any of that money. Then, of course, we cannot eat grass and survive. Although it may be tasty to some, our digestive system cannot break it down and really get the nutrients from it very well. So we rely on, often in a complete system when we think about it, a lovely animal here can actually convert this grass to something we can utilize. And if we're talking about areas of the world that have slopes or things that we probably don't want to grow crops on, this is another component in that system. So then we have the water cycle, and this is equally as important as the carbon cycle, because without the water, and without soil, we don't have life. And so this water is important for this plant. And of course, we have precipitation that allows that water to come down into the soil, and hopefully that water goes down into the soil. And of course, we have evaporation from the surface of the soil. And if we have this covered up, we've shown that we reduce evaporation. If we have some mulch layer there, it actually reduces the amount of water lost to the atmosphere from the soil surface. And of course, the plant will transpire water as well. And so it is going to take water up from the roots and transpire it into the atmosphere, where it then hopefully gets turned into a cloud and then rains back down again. This is both important for this plant to be living, but it is also important for the microbes that live in the soil, because they require water as well, and often not just for their own bodies like we require water, but they actually use it as a modes of transportation. Often the bacteria can utilize the water layer to actually travel through the soil, and there are some bacteria that live in the soil that are very beneficial for nutrient cycling. So when we talk basically about nutrient cycles, we want to look at it as very simplistic way of breaking it down is that it's very much like these other soils. We have water and air that are going to be part of the soil. We need that for the microbes to actually be active. And then the plant matter that lands down onto the soil, it breaks down through, thankfully, the organisms. Without organisms, we would never leave our houses. We wouldn't be able to get outside because we'd have so many leaves and detritus out there that we would never be able to go anywhere. And so we want to thank all those little microbes for breaking down all of the organisms or the olive leaves and things that fall off the trees and put them back into the ground. Of course, that decomposes and breaks down, and then through some processes that are over a much larger scale of time, rocks and other subsoils, they break down and they do slowly release nutrients. The clays weather and release nutrients into the soil as well, often helped by some microbials, often the mycorrhizae fungi that can they exude an enzyme that it allows those nutrients to be taken off of those clay particles. And then the soil can absorb the nutrients, or they store the nutrients for the plant to absorb them later. Now, a plant can actually only take up nutrients in the soil solution. So this water is not only important for the microbes, but it is important for the plant to be able to actually get the nutrients up into its components. It can't take it up in dry soil. So often, if you have a nutrient deficiency and it looks like your plants are just not doing well and it hasn't rained in a while, it doesn't mean you need to add nutrients. It just means you need to water. So now just going into a couple of the nutrient cycles, because often nitrogen is the one that many people think of as the nutrient we need to add. The plant does need it in the most amount, and it's a slippery little thing, and it often finds its way out of the soil and into waterways, unfortunately, or into the air. And so it is very dynamic. There are multiple different forms of nitrogen in the atmosphere. It's N2 gas. But many plants are not capable of actually taking that nitrogen out of the air and making it into something that they can utilize. And so they, though, can make a nice relationship with some symbiotic organisms like rhizobium bacteria and mycorrhizae fungi, and they then can access that nitrogen and either pull it from the atmosphere or pull it out of the soil from some other component and be able to actually give that to the plant in exchange for a little bit of carbon. It's a nice little exchange system that these symbiotic relationships have, is that the carbon is the currency. So the plant gives a little bit of carbon, maybe at a loss for some growth of that plant, but in exchange, it's able to access nutrients that it otherwise would have difficulty getting. So we have the nitrogen fixing bacteria here that then, like this is like a soybean plant or some other bean plant, if it does have rhizobium in the soil, and it's not always there. So if you are a gardener and you want to, say, plant a legume, you do actually need to inoculate them with the correct rhizobium to get that actual beneficial relationship going on there. And we have the nitrifying soil bacteria that makes the ammonium from some other nitrogen sources, some what we call organic nitrogen sources, and this is an inorganic form. And so plants can only take up nitrogen in two forms. They actually take it up in ammonium, which is NH4+, and they take it up into nitrate, which is, or not nitrate, here we go, which is NO3-. And when nitrogen is in the soil, it quickly goes from ammonium to nitrate. It does switch quickly over from nitrites to nitrates, but this is such a quick process that we just often talk about just these two, ammonium and nitrates. Ammonium, being positively charged, will actually stick around in the soil a little bit longer because most clay minerals and organic matter have negative charges on them. And so they're attracted to negative charges because opposites attract. And so they hang out. Nitrates, on the other hand, are negatively charged. And so unless you have a little bit of what we call anion exchange capacity within your soil, and all soils do have a little bit of it. So that means some particles that have positive charges on them. But often this is why we say that nitrogen leaches, because because of these bacteria, these pesky guys constantly take this ammonium, put it over to the nitrates. And unless this plant is actively growing and taking up this readily available form of nitrate, a rainstorm comes along and it leaches, which is often why you do not want to put a large amount of nitrogen out onto your soil, because it doesn't benefit. You often just lose it and it goes into our waterways and causes pollution. So this next nitrogen cycle or nutrient cycle is the phosphorus. And this one is the one that is often the most difficult to kind of figure out what's going on, but it is, it's perplexing scientists even now, is how to keep it in this or get it into this center one, this available phosphorus, where it can be in the soil solution. Because we have 3 different mechanisms that are constantly changing this phosphorus and making it very unavailable. So you could take a soil test and you can measure it, and perhaps it says you have a lot of phosphorus in your soil, but it's just not available for your plant. Because we have these adsorption and desorption properties that happen. And this actually has to do with the chemical component. We have weathering and precipitation. And this is, again, a little bit of chemical processes that are breaking down from the mineral component. And then we have this organic component, or the biological component, of organisms that are both locking it up into their body, immobilization, or releasing it, mineralization. And so often this here is controlled very much by the pH of the soil, which I am not going to take time to talk about tonight. But if you go to the soil health for high tunnels, that one I covered a little bit more on the pH. But this is where we want to focus on, if we can't get it easily into this form, the one thing is, if we have a high biological community that is active within our soil, they can manage making that phosphorus available, because they have mechanisms that can more easily make that phosphorus available for our plants. So again, I think I've already mentioned this, but just to really reiterate that these nutrients are going to be available within the soil solution. And one thing to understand is nature likes a balance. And so when this plant takes up one of these nutrients from here, at that point, one of those of that same nutrient or of the same charge comes over here. And so this soil solution will always be balanced. So when let's say the root pulls up a positive charge, it actually releases a positive charge. And so when you think about that, this is constantly going to be changing, but it is always going to be in balance. And so if the plant takes up a calcium, often you end up having a calcium replaced here. But this cannot function if we don't have water within the soil. That's a very important component. So nutrient uptake into a plant is often done or is done in 3 different mechanisms, and it depends on the nutrient and how that is going to be taken up by the soil. So we have 2 kind of main classes of nutrients. We have the mobile nutrients. Those are the slippery wickets in the soil. They often don't stay around. They can easily be leached, but they can also easily be accessed by the plant. Then you have the immobile nutrients, and often these do not move very much in the soil, which is beneficial for perhaps maybe you're not losing so much of them unless you have them in high amounts, but they become more difficult for the plant to access, and often they are located more closely to the root compared to these mobile nutrients, which can easily be, can flow towards the roots. So just digging deeper into these 3 mechanisms, we have mass flow, which is essentially a kind of like a vacuum. It's as the plant takes up water, these nutrients just flow easily towards, in the soil solution, easily towards that root tip and get taken up as the plant takes up water. They're fairly easy, and the plant is not expending that much energy in doing so. However, they are controlled by water content as well as temperature. Some plants do not actually transpire or even have functioning roots in cold soil, and so that can control some of that. And we have diffusion. This is against a concentration gradient. So an area of high concentration generally likes to go to an area of low concentration. So as that plant takes up one nutrient, those other nutrients will flow over towards that. And this is controlled by also cation exchange capacity as well as the pH of the soil, especially around the root area, what we are going to refer to as the rhizosphere. Then lastly, we have root interception. And root interception is where that root basically has to grow over to that particular nutrient in order to be able to access it and take it up. And particularly in the case of phosphorus. Phosphorus does not move through the soil very quickly at all. It's like extremely slow moving. And so here we have this mycorrhizae. And so through this symbiotic relationship, this plant, even though it can't necessarily get this phosphorus over here, this mycorrhizae can actually access that phosphorus and bring it over and make an exchange for carbon with that plant. So some things that can actually affect this are pH, because your pH can affect actually the growth of the root tip if you have too high acidic conditions, which then if your root can't grow to the nutrient, it's not going to access it, as well as disease pressure on the roots if you have some kind of root disease that is affecting the growth, and then soil texture and compaction. If your soil is so compacted that that root can't get through it, it's not going to be able to access that nutrient, and then of course it doesn't get it and take it up. So this is kind of looking at that a little bit closer. If we're looking at what that mycorrhizae relationship is, that this arbuscular mycorrhizae fungi actually grows into the root cells and is able to really easily make that exchange of nutrients. But it's important to ensure that we are curating a space where these organisms can live and have that exchange. So in looking at that nutrient cycling from the biotic point of view, there's a lot on this slide. I'm going to walk you through it. We have the crop that actively is growing. It is taking up carbon dioxide and water. Then the crop is done, or it's the end of the season, or we harvest it and we leave some residue behind, or perhaps this is cover crops. And so you have some decaying matter, and in come the soil biota that they need oxygen in order to function in the decomposition of these residues. So in the decomposition, they actually also release carbon dioxide and water through that decomposition, which if we have an actively growing crop can take up those. That decomposition then breaks down and turns into what we call humic matter, humus, and some of those nutrients are immobilized by other organisms that are going to utilize that. And some of that will actually get broken out into what we call proteins and polysaccharides, fancy words for something that are the constituent parts of some of these organisms that when they die, they release that. Some of these can actually become part of the soil structure. They are where we would say we have carbon sequestered in the soil, because now it is part of that soil structure. It's stuck there. And then, of course, these organisms die and they release or mineralize. You have mineralization of a certain nutrient, which releases those nutrients that either can be utilized by another organism or utilized by the crop. And so this continually cycles, allowing nutrients to be available. And these are all of the players within that soil food web. And they have different degrees or layers. We have the larger organisms that break down the leaves, the much bigger pieces. And then from there, they then are allowing those to be eaten by the next group. So we have these organic residues that then feed these organisms, that then feed these organisms, or you may have some bacteria that break that down, some fungi, some actinomycetes, and there's lots of different organisms within that soil, and they all have a role to play in breaking down that organic residue that's left behind and releasing those nutrients. But there are things that influence the nutrient availability. And we have heat or drought or lack of water, Of course, flooded conditions also affect that, because if you have no oxygen within your system because it's completely flooded, your microbes aren't going to be active either, or they need oxygen in order to really work well. Then, of course, if we go through and we make super fluffy soil with a tiller, we are infusing it with oxygen. We are supercharging the microorganisms, but we're also beating them up and kind of wrecking their homes. So perhaps reducing that, one, because we want that carbon to stay within the soil as much as possible. But also, when we supercharge those organisms, they're releasing all those nutrients. But yet we currently don't have anything growing here. So then we lose the nutrients through leaching if they have that possibility for that to happen. So it's kind of a little bit is okay, but a lot is not. And then, of course, we have the cover crops, which are going to add a food source for the organisms and help hold on to the nutrients. The other, we're going to go through some of the factors a little bit at a time. So one is temperature, and temperature may lead to that crusty soil and that drought, as you saw in that image. It's also understanding how that temperature affects the microbial activity. So here we have a very rudimentary drawing of showing temperature against the microbial activity. When it's kind of cold outside, our microbes are kind of chill. They're like, nope, I'm not working today. It's too cold. I'm not going out there. So they're very inactive. Then as that temperature increases, those microbes begin to be more and more active until a point at which they crash because it's just too hot outside. And so when it's super hot, where the sun is beating down on that bare soil, those microbes are also likely either dead or have gone into hibernation and just decided, nope, today is not the day I'm going to be munching on carbohydrates in the soil and breaking down organic matter. And so your system crashes, and now not only do you have lots of very unhappy microbes because it's so hot outside. I certainly don't want to be working when it's 100 degrees outside. I don't want the microbes, probably don't want to either. And unfortunately, they are not going to be releasing nutrients either. And so unless you have a bank of nutrients that are available, likely soon it will be depleted. The other important component of this is looking at soil aggregates. I like to think of this as the little mobile homes for the microorganisms. They live within these little aggregates, and they also play an important part in making these aggregates. Microbe spit and other exudates actually allow those aggregates to be formed and stick together, and these are super important. And when we look on a micro scale, this is kind of what it looks like. We have clay particles of various types. We have a little bit of water in here. We have some organic matter. We have a little bacteria hanging out there. Probably have a little mycorrhiza growing in here. And in this little teeny little microparticle, this is the space where these organisms can inhabit, and perhaps these little guys can hide from a larger organism that wants to eat them. And so they can hang out. But if we continue to beat the soil up or have practices that cause this to be beaten up by maybe the energy of a raindrop, then these little organisms have nowhere to survive, and they often have reduced numbers, which means reduced nutrient cycling. And these aggregates are play an important role for many other things. And so this is a demonstration of a slake test. And essentially you take a particle of soil that is dry, it's a big chunk of soil, and you have these have each had different management practices. And this is often taken from a no-till system that incorporates cover crops. And this here is taken from a conventional system. They both are the same soils, but this has a lot more of the soil aggregation due to the high degree of microbial activity because of the lack of disturbance. And these are not moved up and down. This is just breaking down as it's just sitting there with the water. Could you imagine with a rainstorm that even if you had a little bit of rain on the top and this breaks down, and then even with the water sitting there, all of this soil continues to just kind of no longer allow water to infiltrate through it, it breaks up. And then if you get a little bit of a slope, you then begin to easily lose this soil and through erosion. So feeding our microbial community and having living roots within that soil is often really important. So you have your crop that you're growing, your commodity crop or cash crop or vegetable crop or whatever you have that growing. And then when that's done, it's important to continue to feed your organisms so they're around for the next time when you need them to nutrient cycle to the next crop that you hope to harvest. So by incorporating cover crops, not only do they benefit in so many other ways, and increasing water infiltration, and increasing nitrogen, and also helping to break the energy of a raindrop on the soil surface. They also feed the microorganisms within the soil as well. So this image is just to show you the power of cover crops. And so this was taken at the University of New Hampshire, and they did a cover crop trial that they grew a whole bunch of different types of cover crops. I think they grew about 30 different types, but the cover crops are not here anymore. This is the next year. They actually seeded this, I believe, with just either a grass, might have been a rye, over top of this. And what this is showing is these individual blocks are the legacy of the nutrients that are left of what each of those cover crops brought up. You can see some of these are really, really green. And one would consider that to be what you want your plants to look like, healthy, nice and green, and not yellow. So some of these cover crops were able to reach down into the soil, and they brought those nutrients up to the surface and then slowly release them to the next crop that was here. But some of the other types of cover crops that they had in there did not necessarily do the same type of job. And so these were individual cover crops. You imagine if you made a mix of these, and perhaps where one benefits one aspect, something else comes in and fills in another niche. So understanding all of this is there's a lot with all of the nutrient cycling, and you have control factors and all that, but we take a step back and we need to understand that when we look at a system, the most important thing is to understand the part that's limiting everything. So if you take a soil test and it tells you your potassium is low, let's just say, and you think, all right, all I have to do is add potassium and I'll fix the problem. But you have to ensure that you have checked the boxes of other things. What is the temperature out? Is the soil moist? Were there factors for that potassium to be taken up, perhaps? So it is not just about taking a measurement and addressing it because some test said you were low in something. It's important to understand that it is a system, and you need to make sure you're addressing the most limiting nutrient. If it hasn't rained in 2 months and I don't irrigate, I could add all the nutrients I want, and it is not going to address the problem. Irrigation is going to address the problem, or a rain dance and hope for a rainstorm, right? So with all of this information about what you need, and there's so many people with lots of recommendations, ensure that you are also understanding all of the things that affect that nutrient availability before addressing the problem, ensuring that you're addressing the right one. And so finally, to get to the end and really just look about how do we balance the system and ensure that we, I think that's the key, is bringing a system into balance. Once it's in balance, it's going to work better and be functioning without as many inputs. So as I've alluded, managing water. So that may be something like drip irrigation, ensuring that you have that down near and close to the root system. But when we look at drip irrigation, understanding what soil type you have and how that water moves through the soil. Adding mulch to actually conserve the water so it doesn't evaporate quite so fast. By increasing our organic matter, it's like a sponge. It's going to help absorb some of that water because it increases the surface area within the soil, but also it benefits in allowing more water to get into the soil in what we call infiltration. And improving that soil aggregation not only will benefit your microbial community and keep their houses intact, but also that allows the water to infiltrate through, but also energy from raindrops will not degrade that soil quite as quickly if you have a rainstorm that passes. And then cover crops actually help in managing water because they do absorb, just like organic matter, they'll absorb that. They also, their roots are going to allow some of that water to go down into the soil, and they will break the energy of the raindrops as well. And then temperature. Temperature can be controlled. I mean, we can't control the temperature outside unless we put in a shade cloth. We can do that. You can put fans in your field, and you can also think about how you orientate your rows, certainly. And then you can help in reducing the temperature of the soil by adding the mulches, because then, especially if it's a mulch like a straw mulch, it's a little bit lighter in color, that may reflect some more of that energy from the sun and reduce the temperature underneath. Orientating your rows, thinking about how the shadow is if you're trying to grow in the summertime and you're growing a crop that maybe doesn't like it quite so hot, and ensuring you have good airflow can also be beneficial. And organic matter, as I've said, build the organic matter because this is the fuel for microbial community, which equals plants' nutrients, that they can also hold on to the nutrients until they're slowly released by the decomposition process. And so they're like a bank account for the nutrients. If you have that organic matter there, it will slowly release those nutrients that were part of it as it grew when it was alive. It's like a sponge, it holds on to water. And then if you're going to incorporate compost, it's really important to know your source of compost. I am an advocate for compost, but I am not an advocate for adding compost that may have some legacy herbicide in it that will ruin all of your crops. And so know your source, and it is important to ensure that you understand that if you're getting it from, let's say, someone who has horses and they feed their horse hay, if that hay came off of a field that had a particular type of herbicide sprayed on it that can actually last for up to 4 years. It passes through the gut of the animal and can actually still be in that compost and still kill the next broadleaf crop that it is applied to. It is important to know if you have something that you're growing, you put compost on it, it looks weird and it has crazy leaves, it's likely from that. So I see a lot more of it as an extension agent nowadays, with people sending me pictures of their sad little potato plant. And once the damage is done, unfortunately, it will break down in the next year, but solanaceae crops, so that's peppers, tomatoes, eggplant, and potatoes, those are extremely sensitive to that. And then cover crops. There is a cover crop mix for just about anyone in any situation, but is understanding a little bit more about that. The last soil health session I did with Nathan Lauder from NRCS, he's a soil health specialist. There's lots of resources there for what type of cover crop, understanding how to incorporate them into the system. It is not a one size fits all, but it's a little bit of trial and error, and you can, it's the benefits are vastly outweighing any of the learning curve. And you can fit them into crop rotations. You can even put them within the rows as living mulch right there, and they will, again, that's increasing organic matter. But it also improves compaction. There are many of these cover crops that actually have a really good penetrating power that can break up some of that plow pan, allowing more water to get down below into the soil where you want it. So in conclusion, first, though, you do need to take a soil test. I will beat this until that little horse is dead. Take a soil test and a tissue test. If you are really perplexed as to why your crops aren't doing very well, take a soil test at the same time, take a tissue test. Submit them to your state lab or wherever you have in your state or location, because it's important to not only understand what's there in the soil, but also what the plant is actually able to take up. Because I think taking a soil test is important, especially for pH. Adjust pH before anything else. Get that in order, and often many of the other things will fall into place. But it's only half the equation. Understanding what the plant was actually able to access can really help you understand, oh, the nutrient was available, but the plant wasn't able to take it up. Now what is happening? Why? Oh, maybe I have some root disease that is causing that problem. And incorporate all the soil health practices that will really benefit your soil and the soil health. So cover crops and building the organic matter, reducing disturbance, because that's so important, as well as rotating your crops for not only the health of the soil, but the health of your plants, because you would reduce the disease pressure by not always putting the same type of crop in the same place. And reducing the negative impacts through your through this will all really help benefit the organisms within the soil, and we'll build a good food web. So with that, I am going to take questions and the share. All right. So I actually see there's one question that someone posted in the chat, and I do apologize. I actually, because I'm running this show alone, I kept all of the chats just for me to see, so you guys don't get to see what other people are posting, but I will read them out loud for you. So first question is, when is the time to cut back a cover crop? And do I leave the roots to decompose undisturbed? Definitely leave the roots. The organisms will thank you. And when to cut them back or to break them, it really actually depends. Well, it depends on multiple things, but a key is to understand what cover crop you actually grew and when is the best time to destroy that or begin to break that. Often it's very complex in that there are some that you need to get before they flower, some that you need to get when they flower, some that you get after they set seed. And so understanding some of that is a really great resource. And Joanne, I can send you that link that Nathan Lauder presented last time. And it's kind of like a periodic table for cover crops. And it has all sorts of information in there that the soil health group in RCS put together. So it's really, really beneficial. I'm just going to write that down so I don't forget. All right. Okay. Right. Taylor asks, what do you recommend for integrating compost and organic matter into your soil in a no-till system? Just apply and not integrate and plant directly. Yes, the organisms are going to do a dandy job of being able to do that. Often the worms are going to help you along that path, as well as that will just slowly get integrated. I mean, if you walk into the forest, you see the layer of leaves that are around from maybe the last year or two. If you really dig down, you dig down a little bit and that's kind of like slowly getting into the soil. I mean, the rain and all those other things, because what's released by the breakdown of the organic matter is also what's called humic acid and fulvic acid. It's kind of something that can be water soluble. And so in actuality, some of the stuff that becomes part of the soil structure and will feed some other organisms actually becomes more liquid with rain and can make its way down. So I would say err on the side of don't disturb as much rather than trying to mix it in, because essentially what would happen is you now are going to degrade that organic matter faster because you infuse it with oxygen. So better to kind of keep it, because compost also can act as a mulch. So it will slowly make its way through. And if the roots need it, they'll just stay up near the top of the surface and access what they need. Let's see. Oh, will you please explain tissue tests? Okay, so tissue tests. So in North Carolina, we the North Carolina Department of Agriculture has a lab that they'll do tissue tests. And a tissue test is essentially that you take a certain number of leaves, and often you want not the youngest and you don't want the most mature. And they will let you know, usually through instructions of telling you what plant you want. Usually it's like the fifth leaf down from the youngest leaf or the top, because it's kind of one that is fully opened, fairly mature, but isn't old and like going to be completely devoid of nitrogen, because there are some nutrients that are very mobile in the plant. And so, for instance, nitrogen deficiency, very easy to detect in a plant, because if you have yellowing leaves that are the oldest leaves, that is a plant that is starting to become deficient in nitrogen, because the plant can actually move the nitrogen to the newest leaves where it needs it the most. But there are other nutrients, such as sulfur, that actually does the opposite, that it is not mobile, so it's less likely to be in the top of the plant. The plant can try to speak. It does it through colors and different patterns, but it's like you have to learn to speak its language. And some it can be very hard to detect, except for nitrogen, which is very easy to see. So it is often best to get a tissue test, because the other thing is our human eye can detect it after the problem's been really far gone. A tissue test can often tell when it's just starting to become a problem. And it often isn't something that's quick enough turnaround time to address necessarily issue right now, unless you test early enough, unless you have a really good relationship with your lab and they can turn around like that. But it can help you address the problem in the future. And so you can kind of see, oh, well, next year I need to do X or Y because these plants were deficient in this particular nutrient. And then I have Can you have too much organic matter in the soil? Yes, you technically can. You cannot necessarily, or not really necessarily good to just say grow in straight compost. You need the minerals and you need the actual soil, unless of course you're growing in a soilless medium, which has peat moss and perlite and other things that do lots of other jobs that kind of pitch hit for the actual mineral part or component of the soil. But you can have too much organic matter. Often it can lead to salinization in the soil and other conditions. If in fact you have conditions like let's say in a greenhouse, this is where we often have this. Lots of people put a ton of compost in there, but it's not raining. You're irrigating, and often in a high tunnel or a greenhouse situation, they're irrigating with a drip irrigation. So they're trying to keep it really low to the surface. And then unfortunately what that does is it causes a salt layer to build up at the top, and that has problems. So often you need to kind of leach out the water through either taking the cover off the high tunnel or adding a lot of water in there through a sprinkler system to allow those salts to get back. In nature, it just happens through rainfall. But yet, if you're in a desert area, you can have salt build up. Now let's see, I have, what are your thoughts on occultation, blocking the light to a crop patch by covering, oh yes, silage harps. Yep. I think they're great. This process does not require tilling. Actually, we had Dr. Richard Smith at the University of New Hampshire did some research on silage charts, see how they did with organic matter, soil health, and things like that. And the consensus was, other than a little bit of extra labor, and obviously if you have 100 acres, maybe a silage chart might be tad hard to incorporate into your plan. But even if you had a couple of acres, it was well worth using that, because it has so many benefits beyond just breaking down the cover crop, but it also helped in weed management as well. And often the thing with weed management is by reducing disturbance, weed seeds only need 10 seconds of light to germinate. So every time you go out and till to get rid of weeds, you just increase your weeds because you just bring up weed seeds from down below. And as soon as they get a little bit of light, unless of course you use a red light until at night. If you do that, maybe you would get around that situation. But certainly using the silage tarps to break things down benefits for weed, as well as getting those cover crops down without using herbicide. Let's see, we have another question. Aside from crop production, how best to improve soil with existing landscape plants? Typically use lots of leaf litter and wood chips, but many of my plants, most of which are native, still don't seem to thrive. I know that clay content is high and have had a hard time retaining water. Yeah, it's a tough situation, especially if they are existing, because you don't know where their roots are, how the soil was prepared before they were planted. And if it's clay, it's a slow process. But if you continue to ensure you add a little bit of that organic matter, and perhaps maybe use, you can also use a broad fork. They have these things you can kind of drive down in there, maybe to loosen it up a little bit around, a little bit away from the root ball. You can try to do some things like that to loosen up. But some of the native plants, if they're growing in pure on clay, is like where I live here. Yeah, it can be difficult. Often what I do is I dig them up and I make a mound and I redo it if I really want them to thrive. Because I also have areas where it's super wet and we end up with no drainage when we get a lot of rain. So when you have clay, you can have lots of issues, and often it takes a little while to change clay texture, or a very long time. So organic matter can assist, but if they're not thriving, they may just be, their roots aren't even growing outside into the clay. All right, let's see. Living at the top of a hill, are there any steps that I can take to minimize leaching of nutrients from the soil? Well, things that are always living are going to hold on to as many nutrients as possible. So if you continue to err on trying to have the cover crops, have the organic matter that are slowly releasing them, that is the only thing that you really can do. Because even if you live at the top of the hill or down at the bottom of the hill, those nutrients are still going down into the soil. The biggest thing though, if you're living at the top of a hill, is ensuring you don't have erosion. And so whether that's sometimes like building a berm so that you can capture some of the water when you have rainfall, and within that, if you have some organic matter that also acts as a sponge, that can help. There are some practices that allow you to do that. Is there a cost for a tissue test? Yes, in some places there are, in some places there aren't. It's $5 in North Carolina to do a tissue test and submit that. And they email you the results. And Diane, if you contact me via email, I will get you the link to be able to access that in North Carolina. Strive for 5% organic matter. Exactly. Strive for it. If you're in North Carolina, if you can make 5%, you're doing something really, really well. But reducing disturbance helps move the needle towards that. My mother has 13% organic matter, but she's in New Hampshire. So she has like really cold temperatures and a frost line that goes down 4 feet in the wintertime. So the organisms aren't breaking down the organic matter for quite the same amount of time as we have in North Carolina, where we pretty much have them active almost all year round. Oh, sorry. Can you add too much organic matter? Yes, you can add too much organic matter. I mean, it's like anything. A little is good, a lot is just too much at one time. You know, I like to drink wine, but if I drank a whole gallon, I probably would not be doing very well. But if I have a glass, I'm doing okay. So it's like that for the organisms. You know, there can only be so much organic or biological activity within the soil. So if you add more than necessarily is going to feed them very well, it's just going to kind of hang out there and sit, and it may become more of a problem. Let's see, and we are at 7 o'clock. Let me see if there's any more questions. What was your take on municipal water with chlorine for irrigating? Does it destroy the microbial activity in the soil? That is a question I'm not sure. I have to think about. I have a well, and I can't stand drinking city water. So, and I'm not a microorganism, but I don't like it. So I don't know, but I would imagine that in the content that it is allowed for us as organisms to be able to consume it, and by the time it oxygenates out there and gets into the oxygen, that usually often dissipates to a point that it probably is likely not going to be a problem. Because if it was, I would likely think that we wouldn't have very nice lawns in the city, or so thinking it's okay.